300 warships have been blocked from returning to the Black Sea, not by NATO, not by sanctions, by 31 kilometers of Turkish water, a narrow corridor called the Bosphorus, and the country that controls it hasn't fired a single shot. This is the Turkish Straits, the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. Together they form the only maritime passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. No ship gets through without Turkey's permission. That is not a metaphor. It is international law. Most people couldn't find these straits on a map, but every major power on Earth, Russia, the United States, China, NATO, watches them constantly. Because whoever controls this passage controls the flow of war, energy, and food for half the planet. 2 open loops before we go deeper. First, Turkey is a NATO member, but it has not followed NATO's playbook on Russia. Second, the treaty that governs these straits is nearly 90 years old, and it was never written for a war like this one. Both of those facts are about to matter enormously. Stay with this, because by the end, you'll understand why a 31-kilometer strip of water may be the most important piece of real estate in the current world order, and why Turkey's silence on it is the loudest strategic statement being made right now. In 1936, world powers gathered in Switzerland and signed a document called the Montreux Convention. It handed Turkey sovereign control over the Turkish Straits. It set strict rules on which warships could pass, how many, and for how long. And it has governed this waterway ever since. The core rule is this: in times of war, Turkey can close the straits to warships of belligerent nations. That means, if Turkey determines a country is at war, it can legally block that country's navy from using the Bosphorus. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Turkey activated that clause within days. This was a significant decision. Russia had major warships stationed in the Mediterranean, in Syria, that suddenly could not return home through the Bosphorus. They were stranded on the wrong side of the choke point. That is not a small problem. That is a permanent operational constraint. But here is where it gets complicated. The Montreux Convention also says Turkey cannot block warships from returning to their home ports, even in wartime. So Russia's Black Sea fleet, already in the Black Sea, stays there. Turkey can't expel them. It can only prevent reinforcement. What this means strategically, Russia's Black Sea fleet is in effect sealed. It cannot receive major reinforcements. It cannot be easily rebuilt if ships are destroyed. And as we've seen in this war, Ukrainian strikes have already sunk or damaged a significant portion of that fleet. Turkey's move made every Ukrainian missile more permanent in its effect. But Turkey did not join sanctions. It did not send weapons to Ukraine. It maintained trade ties with Russia. That is not contradiction. That is strategy. Ankara is playing every side of this board simultaneously, and the Bosphorus is its most powerful chip. To understand why this strait matters so much, you need to understand what it connects and what it separates. The Black Sea is essentially a closed body of water. It has one exit, just one, and that exit runs through the heart of Istanbul. 6 countries border the Black Sea: Russia, Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Georgia, and Turkey. Of those 6, Russia has the largest naval presence and the most to lose from being cut off. The Black Sea is Russia's only warm water access to the Mediterranean without going through Arctic waters. This matters because Russia's global power projection has always depended on warm water access. Its northern ports freeze for months. Its Pacific fleet is too far from the major conflict zones. The Black Sea Fleet was designed to threaten NATO's southern flank, project power into the eastern Mediterranean, and support operations in Syria. All of that runs through the Bosphorus. Now consider Turkey's geography. It sits at the junction of Europe and Asia. It shares a border with 8 countries. It controls both ends of the Turkish Straits, and it sits directly across from Russia's naval ambitions. No other NATO member has this combination of strategic exposure and strategic leverage simultaneously. This is why Erdogan never commits fully to either side. He doesn't have to. The geography already committed him to relevance. Every major power needs Turkey more than Turkey needs any one of them. And that asymmetry, that is the source of Ankara's power. Warships are only part of the story. The Bosphorus is also one of the world's busiest commercial shipping corridors. Roughly 48,000 vessels pass through it annually. That includes oil tankers from the Caspian Sea, grain shipments from Ukraine and Russia, and raw material flows that feed European and Middle Eastern economies. When Russia invaded Ukraine, grain shipments from Black Sea ports became a global crisis. Ukraine and Russia together account for roughly 30% of the world's wheat exports. The Bosphorus is the only route those shipments can take. Turkey brokered the grain deal in 2022 that temporarily kept that corridor open. It was not altruism. It was leverage management. Energy flows through here too. Azerbaijan's oil from the Caspian Basin moves by tanker through the Bosphorus to European markets. Kazakhstan does the same. When Russia faces sanctions, these alternative pipelines and shipping routes become critical. Turkey's control over the Strait makes it a gatekeeper of European energy security, whether it wants to be or not. There is also TurkStream, a gas pipeline that runs under the Black Sea from Russia directly to Turkey and then into southern Europe. Even as NATO countries were cutting Russian energy links, gas was still flowing through this pipeline. Turkey was both enforcing the Montreux Convention against Russia and maintaining a Russian energy corridor simultaneously. That is not a mistake. That is the policy. Here is the core tension. Turkey's energy dependency on Russia and its economic ties to Moscow make full alignment with NATO economically painful, but Montreux gives Turkey the legal high ground to control military access without choosing a side. It is a perfect position, if you are willing to hold it under pressure. Erdogan has been. The Montreux Convention is not invincible. Several NATO members, including the United States, have argued that Turkey should interpret it more aggressively. To further restrict Russia's naval movements, Ukraine has explicitly asked Turkey to close the strait entirely. Turkey has refused, and the reasons reveal exactly how Ankara sees its own position. Closing the strait entirely, beyond what Montreux requires, would be a direct act of war against Russia in legal and diplomatic terms. Turkey is not willing to cross that line. It benefits from the war being unresolved. A frozen conflict keeps everyone dependent on Turkish mediation. Resolution, in either direction, reduces Ankara's value. There is also the treaty itself. Russia is a signatory to Montreux. If Turkey goes beyond what the convention allows, Russia could declare the entire treaty void and demand open access rights through the straits. That outcome would be catastrophic for Turkey's strategic position. The convention is a cage, but Turkey holds the key, and Russia knows it. Then there is the question of what happens if the war escalates into a direct NATO-Russia confrontation. In that scenario, the Montreux Convention's rules around belligerent nations apply to NATO members too. Turkey would face the legally defensible position of restricting Allied warships as well. It is an uncomfortable truth that few NATO planners want to address publicly. None of this has exploded, yet Turkey has managed the pressure with a combination of legal precision and strategic ambiguity. But the system is under strain. The Montreux Convention was written for a world that no longer exists. And the wars being fought around the Black Sea are testing its limits in ways no one in 1936 anticipated. 3 scenarios are worth watching. First, a ceasefire in Ukraine that includes a Black Sea security framework. In this case, Turkey becomes the guarantor power and gains formal, permanent influence over one of the world's most strategic waterways. That is an enormous prize. Second scenario, war escalation. If NATO becomes directly involved in the conflict, Turkey faces its hardest choice. It cannot indefinitely maintain neutrality inside an alliance at war. At some point, legal precision becomes political impossibility. The Montreux framework would be tested in ways that could fracture it, and fracture the alliance with it. Third scenario, a post-war realignment in which Russia's Black Sea fleet is permanently degraded and a new regional security architecture is negotiated. In that world, the Montreux Convention may be renegotiated entirely. Turkey would sit at that table with more leverage than any other power in the room, because it has been the most consistent neutral party throughout the conflict. What is clear is this: the Turkish Straits are no longer a Cold War footnote. They are an active pressure point in a live conflict. And Turkey's management of them, legally precise, economically self-interested, and strategically ambiguous, may be the most sophisticated piece of statecraft being practiced anywhere in the world right now. Whether you admire it or distrust it, you cannot ignore it. The Bosphorus doesn't make the news every day, but it shapes the news every day. The ships that pass through it or are blocked from passing through it determine energy prices, food security, and the military balance in one of the most contested regions on the planet. It is, in every meaningful sense, a hinge of history. Turkey understands this better than anyone. Its foreign policy isn't chaos, it is calibration. Every decision Erdogan makes around the Straits is calculated against the same question. Does this increase or decrease our indispensability? That is a cold calculation. But in geopolitics, cold calculations tend to outlast warm alliances. The story of the Turkish Straits isn't over. It has barely begun for this generation. What happens in the Black Sea in the next 5 years will reshape the security architecture of Europe, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East. And at the center of all of it, 31 kilometers of water. If this gave you something to think about, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We cover the events the headlines miss and the strategies that shape what comes next. The story doesn't end here. It evolves. And we'll be here when it does.